Welcome to The F Word, a podcast series that examines, excavates, unpicks and reframes forgiveness through the lives of others. I'm Marina Cantacuzino, a journalist from London, founder of the Forgiveness Project charity, and I've built my career investigating how those who face the most complex and devastating things in life find a way through. Each episode, I'll be talking to a guest who's experienced something very difficult or traumatic in their life, but who rather than respond with hate or bitterness has embraced, or at the very least considered, forgiveness as a response to pain. My guest today is Father Michael Lapsley, an Anglican priest and social justice activist, who in 1973 left his home in New Zealand to continue his vocation in South Africa. Then, in 1990, at the height of the apartheid repression, Father Michael, by now a prominent member of the African National Congress and living in exile in Zimbabwe, received a letter bomb in the post in which he lost both his hands and one eye. While the apartheid regime didn't succeed in taking out their target, they must have assumed Father Michael's influence would now be permanently damaged as he lay in agonizing pain in a Harare hospital. But that was far from the case. In the decades since the attack, Michael Lapsley has achieved an extraordinary amount. He's founded the Healing and Memories Institute in Cape Town and, drawing on his own experience of trauma, dedicated his life to supporting the healing of others. He's also the author of an extremely inspiring and courageous memoir called Redeeming the Past: My Journey from Freedom Fighter to Healer. It's really wonderful, Michael, to have you on the F Word podcast today. You do a lot of travelling, so I was just wondering where in the world you're speaking to me from today.
Well, I'm speaking to you from Cape Town in South Africa. I still travel the world, but I travel from the bedroom to the lounge and then I join Zoom.
That's brilliant. I'd like to start, if you don't mind, Michael, if you could just paint a picture of what you found as a young student priest when you arrived in Durban in South Africa, aged just 24. I'm wondering, were you prepared for a society where everything was divided by race and where you were now not only witnessing individual acts of prejudice and racism, but living under a regime that used laws and organised violence to establish the supremacy of one group over another? I mean, can anything prepare you for that?
Well, before I arrived in South Africa, I had read a great deal about it. So I had a huge amount of head knowledge about the nature of apartheid. But I didn't have the experience. And I think in my naivety, I thought when I arrived in South Africa, I would find three groups of people: the oppressed and the oppressor, and a third group called the human race that I would belong to. And I think the first rude shock was realizing that simply by being white, I was part of the oppressor group, even if I chose to be against it. And I often say that the day I arrived in South Africa, I stopped being a human being and I became a white man, because suddenly every single aspect of my life was decided by the color of my skin. The university where I studied, the park bench I sat on, the toilet I could use, the lift I could enter, the side of the post office I entered, and even to the part of the sea that I could swim in.
And did that affect your ministry going forward?
Well, I was very fortunate that I came to South Africa. I was already a priest. And the religious order I belonged to, the Society of the Sacred Mission, was involved in the university chaplaincy in Durban to 3 campuses, 2 black and 1 white. As a consequence, I ministered to communities of all racial backgrounds in South Africa. And I think that helped me to see that whilst it was true that all white people benefited from apartheid, that all black people suffered under apartheid, that actually all of us were prisoners of apartheid, and that liberation and freedom had to be for everybody, or it would be for nobody.
And I'm guessing at this point you were a member of the ANC, the African National Congress, is that right?
Well, I was very attracted very early on to the moral vision of the ANC of a non-racial democratic society and of a non-sexist society. My problem with the ANC was that after 50 years of non-violence, they had eventually opted for armed struggle. And that for me was a major stumbling block. But when in 1976 school children began to be shot in the streets of South Africa, I came to the very reluctant conclusion that in our context, with our history, that armed struggle had become morally legitimate, necessary, and justified. So then there was no longer an obstacle for me to join the ANC.
Yeah.
But I only did that, the African National Congress of South Africa, after I was expelled from South Africa and went to live in Lesotho.
And Nelson Mandela had also been involved in the armed struggle, hadn't he? Was that an influence on you?
Yes, indeed. And of course, the time I arrived in South Africa, he had already been in prison for many years, but he had accepted himself the legitimacy of that option.
Can we go forward a little bit now? And could you tell me a little bit about the attack, where it happened, why you were a target?
When I was expelled from South Africa, I went first of all to live in the mountain kingdom of Lesotho, which of course is completely surrounded by South Africa. So you were living in a society that was not South Africa, where people were free to relate and none of the apartheid laws existed, and yet people were affected in every way. And I was very much part of the exile community, people who had been forced to leave South Africa and who had fled out of the country, either looking for education or looking for military training. But it was after a massacre in Lesotho in 1982, when I was away from Lesotho, but was believed to be one of the targets of that massacre, that I was then forced to leave Lesotho. And after a few months spent in the United Kingdom, I then came back to Zimbabwe. And I was in Zimbabwe from 1983 till 1992. And again, I worked as a priest there. I completed my master's degree at the University of Zimbabwe. But I was also part of the community of exiles, and I had a pastoral role within the African National Congress of South Africa, working among South African exiles, but also working with education of exiles from creche to university. But thirdly, a key part of my work in the liberation movement was that of mobilizing the faith community internationally to see that at stake in South Africa was the truth of the Christian gospel, because, of course, the apartheid regime claimed divine guidance for what they were doing. But my conclusion was apartheid was an option for death carried out in the name of the gospel of life. And that is why it's an issue of faith to say no to it.
Right, so therefore you became a target.
Yes, I mean, I think that when I did become a target, they never said the reason we have targeted you is ABC. But in reality, I think it was my theology that was a threat to the apartheid state, because my work was a work of delegitimizing, unmasking their claim to be Christian.
Would you mind just talking a little bit about that terrible day when the bomb was sent through the post to you and what happened? It was so appalling because I believe the bomb was placed between the pages of a religious magazine which was sent to you.
Well, I had been on a South African government hit list for a number of years, and I'd actually lived with armed police guards 24 hours a day. But after the apartheid regime agreed to negotiate, my armed guards were taken away. And we thought that war was over and we were now going to negotiate a future. But of course, the apartheid regime resolved to talk in the day, but continue to kill at night. And so what happened to me was a straw in the wind. In that negotiating period, we actually lost thousands of lives as the policy of destabilization of Southern Africa was brought back into South Africa. But as you commented, I received a letter bomb hidden inside the pages of two religious magazines. When the bomb went off, firstly, I had a sense that God was with me somehow in the midst of my pain. But also, I knew immediately that the apartheid regime had got me. and that I was already, in a sense, a victor because I was alive, and so they had failed.
Yeah.
And so then the next period of many months was the period of appropriating that victory. So I was to spend a month in hospital in Zimbabwe and then 7 months in 2 Australian hospitals. But for the years before the bomb went off, I had lived in the countries of Southern Africa, first Lesotho and then Zimbabwe. But I'd also traveled the world as part of the struggle against apartheid. So when I was bombed, there were messages of prayer, love, support from all over the world. I often say that when I die, I won't need a funeral because people said all the nice things then. So my story was acknowledged, reverenced, recognized, given a moral content. Another way of putting it, I was able to travel a journey from being a victim, which I was, a survivor, which I was, but also to victory in the sense of taking back agency. I also realized that if I was filled with hatred, bitterness, self-pity, desire for revenge, that they would have failed to kill the body, but they would have killed the soul.
But there must have been rage there too, no?
Not really rage. I think I was saved from rage. I think the dominant feeling was one of grief. You know, if you lose a loved one, part of you will always grieve for that person. And it's like that when you lose limbs as well. You're
Yes.
losing part of yourself. So part of me will always grieve for the hands that I've lost. So grief, yes, permanent grief. Sometimes it can be moments of frustration. It can be some small thing you're trying to do and you can't do because you've got no hands. I think anger rather than rage, anger against some of the, if you like, the political leaders of the old order who didn't kill anybody, they didn't torture anybody. They sat in parliament and they passed laws that meant immense pain and suffering to millions of people. And insofar, many of them remain in denial about that. That brings about some anger in me in relation to that.
So I suppose when you return to South Africa, you now belong to this new outsider group. Well, I mean, new for you, that of disabled people, where you must have been reminded every minute of the day, because of your extreme disability, of the trauma that had happened to you.
Yes, no, thank you for that. Interestingly, when I came back to Zimbabwe, I was supposed to have become a priest in a new parish in Bulawayo at the time of the bombing. So I came back to my bishop and I said, well, here I am. And he said, but you are disabled now. What can you do? I said, well, I can drive a car, at which point he looked very scared in case he was going to be on the same road that I was. But I said, I think I can be more of a priest with no hands than I ever was with 2 hands. And through the years, I found that my dramatic, obvious physical disability often gives other people permission to share their disability, their brokenness, which for so many of us as people is not visible, but is no less real. So that's why I could say in the bomb, I lost a lot, I still have a lot, and I've gained. I'd say I'm a better human being because of the journey that I've traveled. And it's helped me realize that actually perfection is not the human story, it's imperfection, incompleteness, and that actually we need one another to be fully human.
There's a wonderful quote by the spiritual thinker and writer Richard Rohr. He says, if we do not transform our pain, we will most assuredly transmit it. And I wonder what you think of that in relation to trauma.
Yeah, I think that we either transmit trauma or transform it. So indeed, if something terrible happens to us, we either are diminished or we grow, but we never stay the same. And we don't have power over what other people do to us, but we do always have power over how we respond. But I think also we need support from other people to be able to make life-giving responses, which is key to the work that I do. Integral to African philosophy is that we can't be fully human by ourselves. So in order to heal, we often need other people to accompany us on that journey, not to live our lives for us, but to walk beside us.
Yes, and I imagine, Michael, you've thought very often about this difficult and controversial subject of forgiveness. And I wondered if you could just explain your position around that, because I know you've got some really interesting things to say, especially in relation to bicycle theology.
Often when I tell my story, I say I'm not filled, as I said earlier, with hatred, bitterness, self-pity, or desire for revenge. And then people say to me, "Oh, you're a wonderful example of forgiveness." I say, "But actually, I didn't mention the word forgiveness." So even as we talk today, Marina, I don't know who sent the bomb. I don't know who made it. I don't know what the chain of command is. So for me, in a way, forgiveness is not yet on the table. I continue to travel my journey. And knowing the answer to those questions are abiding questions, but they're not consuming questions. Now, I do speculate in my mind the possibility of somebody knocking at my door and saying, "I'm the one who sent you that bomb. Will you forgive me?" Well, of course, I don't actually know how I would respond, but I speculate that I might say to that person, "Well, excuse me, sir, do you still make letter bombs?" And he says, "No, no, no. Actually, I work just around the corner from you at the Red Cross Children's Hospital. Will you forgive me?" And my answer is, "Yes, of course. Of course I forgive you." And then perhaps we would sit and drink tea, and I say, "Well, sir, I've forgiven you, but I still have no hands. I'll always need somebody to assist me for the rest of my life. Of course, you will help pay for that person, not as a condition of forgiveness, but as part of reparation and restitution and the ways that are possible." You referred, as I often do, to bicycle theology. And bicycle theology is when I come, I steal your bicycle, and then I come back a few months later and I kneel in front of you and say, "I'm terribly sorry that I stole your bicycle. Will you forgive me?" And you say, "Yes, yes, of course, but I keep the bike." And so that is the problem, that often we reduce forgiveness to saying sorry, but we don't commit ourselves to reparation and restitution and the ways that are possible, that are also key elements of the journey of forgiveness. But also, Marina, many of the people I have met around the world, forgiveness is the key to their healing. But for many other people, it's not.
Yes.
When people are hurting, often what they're crying out for is for their pain to be heard and acknowledged.
I think this is such a good point. I remember hearing the South African academic and author Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela speak once. She wrote that brilliant book called A Human Being Died That Night, and she's an expert in memory and trauma. And she said that after years of research into the power of forgiveness, she'd come to the conclusion that actually it was apology and accountability and acknowledgement which were the most important things when it came to healing and moving the story along. And she explained that when people have been wounded, they feel dehumanized. And so the act of apology, by recognizing the pain of the other, rehumanizes and restores dignity.
And the last thing they need is a sermon about forgiveness that actually adds to their burdens. But when people's pain has been heard and acknowledged, sometimes they will then realize that for themselves, there needs to be forgiveness as an act of freedom.
It was interesting because when I started to collect stories of forgiveness in 2003, I kept hearing about this forgiveness conference that had taken place a couple of years earlier at the spiritual community of Findhorn in Scotland, and you'd been invited to speak. And according to these people who were telling me about the conference, some audience members had taken issue with your position of conditional forgiveness. So I was just wondering, Michael, how you respond to that kind of judgment about your position. Conditional forgiveness being that forgiveness has to be earned and deserved through reparation and apology.
Yeah, I think, Marina, people write books that talk about the stages of forgiveness. And in a conceptual way, they're often quite beautiful books. My experience is for most human beings, forgiveness is costly, painful, difficult, and messy. You know, Marina, I forgive you today. I'm not sure about tomorrow. And often people do forgive in their heads, and then something else happens and they realize, maybe actually they haven't. I think also from my faith tradition, I do believe that forgiveness is so big that we need often the power from God to even want to forgive. Because often we damn well don't actually. We want to hold on to it. And I think mine is not so much about being unconditional, but it's more about what are the consequences of journeys of forgiveness, the whole package. You know, in the Christian tradition in the New Testament is a beautiful story of Zacchaeus, the tax collector, who meets Jesus, is accepted unconditionally, has dinner with him, and he is an oppressor, an exploiter, a corrupt tax collector. And in the meeting with Jesus, he says, I will return times 4 what I took wrongfully. So I won't return it with mathematical exactitude. I will return it with generosity of spirit. In other words, I will give back the bike, but I'll give it with new tires and a bell. And I think that's the kind of image of forgiveness that I find to be meaningful. And I think also in situations of oppression, like in South Africa, what does it mean for white people to say to black people, please forgive us for what we did, but excuse me, we'll keep the wealth and the land and the power for ourselves?
And there's something here I just want to share from Father Michael's book, Redeeming the Past. He talks in it about how the white community still has this massive denial of what happened in South Africa. And he says that religion hasn't helped. In fact, it's hindered. He says that people hold this fundamentalist understanding of their faith, says God has forgiven us. And therefore there's this assumption that if blacks are good Christians, they must forgive. And he talks about how there's been so little apology and acknowledgement. And he writes, most victims of apartheid are still not sure if white people feel real remorse about the past. This has serious consequences for our future. Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point you make. And I'm totally with you on forgiveness being messy and complex and about not promoting it or pushing it, which I think is exactly what the Forgiveness Project tries to do. But I remember you saying once that forgiveness can be an act of aggression. And I was just wondering what you meant by that.
Not so much an act of aggression, but it's an accusation. In other words, if I say, Marina, I forgive you, then I'm saying you did it. You know? So in that sense, it's an accusation. And that is often a very serious accusation, whether it's in intimate relations or in relation to political violence. It's part, in one sense, of saying you are responsible for that. And often people who have been perpetrators remain in denial about their own responsibility.
Do you actually think forgiveness isn't very helpful sometimes? And do you find yourself trying to steer away from the conversation?
Well, it's interesting, you know, in our Healing of Memories work, we offer Healing of Memories workshops. And having said that, especially in the South African context, forgiveness is something that virtually every workshop, the participants bring it up as something they struggle with, particularly because it's a very religious society and people have often had forgiveness preached at them and they think there's something wrong with them if they are struggling with it. But later we developed what we call a second phase workshop called Dealing with Anger, Overcoming Hatred, and Struggling with Forgiveness, or whatever. Because we found that people, they often have taken giant steps at the first workshop on their journey of healing, but there's unfinished business. And often the unfinished business is, not always, but often it is around forgiveness. And of course, that's why we also use the term struggling with forgiveness. But certainly, especially to ministers and pastors and very religious people, I sometimes say to them, please be careful that you, with good intentions, are not actually using forgiveness as a weapon against hurting people. You are increasing their burdens when what they want is a loving embrace. What they want is for their pain to be heard, not to add another burden. And you should forgive as well.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's so important. And definitely there are one or two stories that we share at the Forgiveness Project which come from that perspective, where people have been pressurized to forgive, whether that's from a member of a religious community or some kind of self-imposed moral obligation. But it's always been deeply unhelpful and even painful for them.
What's also quite interesting is that when we talk to clergy by themselves, I will often ask them and say, in your life, do you find forgiveness easy? And they will consistently say, no, we don't. So then I say, well, when you preach, do you tell your people that? Oh, no, we never tell them that. So the lived experience of religious people belies sometimes the sermons they preach. And some that I worked with said, we never ever preached about forgiveness the same way once we had that conversation.
Yeah.
And sometimes when I do preach about forgiveness in a sermon and say it's costly, painful, and difficult, at the church door, people often come up to me and say, I'm so thankful that you said that, because it meant that there's not something wrong with me.
Yes, I find the same when I talk, and people expect the Forgiveness Project to be like sort of proselytizing about forgiveness and really trying to persuade people that it's the best and the only way to deal with demons and pain and unresolved issues. And then they're very relieved to find that we position ourselves as a place of inquiry, an exploration, an invitation even. But Michael, ever since the bombing, you've told your story publicly in many different places, multiple times. Does that take its toll, or is it still redemptive in some way for you?
Well, no, thank you for asking that, Marina. There's a film that was made called The Father Michael Lapsley Story. And I'm so relieved because I don't have to tell the story every time. So watch the film, read the book. It is no longer traumatic. In that sense, it's boring. Because, oh dear, here we go again. But interacting with people, I find often extremely rewarding as well, especially when it's a two-way street, that I share something of my experience. And that's key to the work of the Institute, is listening to the pain of others and being able to be there for them. And I think hard listening and to be heard is often what many human beings crave for and find that balm to their wounds when they are truly hurt.
Oh, thank you so much for that and all that you've shared today. And I think we've covered a lot of ground in actually quite a short amount of time. But also, I just wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you to you, Father Michael, for the work that you do and the work of the Healing of Memories Institute, because I've really been influenced, informed, inspired in so many ways over the many years. So thank you.
Thank you, Marina. I appreciate and I value the times we've been together, and I'm looking forward to future occasions as well.
Thank you for listening to the F Word podcast. To dig a bit deeper around some of the themes we've talked about, do check out the show notes by going to theforgivenessproject.com/FWordPodcast. And from there you can also explore the Forgiveness Project website, which over the years has collected and shared many more stories of how people have transformed the darkest of situations. I also want to invite you to join the F Word Podcast Facebook group, especially if you have more to discuss or share. Again, to find the link, go to theforgivenessproject.com/FWordPodcast. But most of all, I hope you'll join me again